So today's session is to be what the Bhagawad Geeta says on happiness. Happiness is a hot topic. It is being taught in all the top universities of the world. Whether you started in Harvard, but all major universities have a course on happiness. And as in Harvard, the courses on happiness are perhaps the largest attended classes in the entire campus. So the question is, what is happiness? And how can we attain happiness? And what does the Bhagavad Geeta say about happiness? So let us start from the very beginning. Let's start from the time. From the beginning of time, let us try to understand whether we were born to be happy. And the answer is, of course, those who are happy were knocked out and killed long ago. Because imagine somebody sitting in bliss, enjoying perfect happiness. And because he's in perfect bliss and enjoying perfect happiness, he is eaten up by a saber-toothed tiger. He is hit on the head by a wandering thug. And in this manner, all those who are likely to be content, to be happy, to be joyful within, are those who suffered the natural slings and arrows of misfortune that the world brings upon us. So who survived? Those who survived were not the happy ones. Those who survived were the anxious ones. Those who survived were the paranoid ones. Those who survived were the discreet, intelligent ones who understood that the world was a dangerous place, that the world is a place of misery. And they passed their genes on to us. Therefore, one of the commonest diseases which is natural to mankind is anxiety. And it's natural because you inherited the genes of the survivors. And they survived simply because they had a high rating on the index of anxiety. Those who had a high rating on the index of happiness died out. So everyone is striving for happiness. There are people who are striving for happiness in one or other manner within the world. The Greeks discovered that there were two types of happiness that one could have. One is called hedonic happiness. And the Greeks said hedonic happiness is that happiness that is attained through pleasure of the senses. And what do we mean by attained through pleasure of the senses? So, the happiness that can be attained through your eyes, your ears, your nose, your sense of touch, your smell, your sense of taste. All that which can be enjoyed in the world through your senses and your mind, this is called hedonic happiness. Unfortunately, what happens is that those who pursue hedonic happiness ultimately experience only distress. And why do they experience distress? They experience distress because the first phenomenon is known as tachyphylaxis. In the medical word, it means that after some time you get used to it. And after you get used to it, it ceases to give you happiness. So if someone was to give you today a lottery ticket that was a winning ticket, so you could have all the happiness that you could ever have with the money that you possess, you could in fact soon discover that within 1 year, the happiness that you got from that ticket, winning lottery ticket, is gone. This is the result of a study which has been conducted on lottery winners. That the joy which you get from winning the lottery can only last for a single year. And if you want to look at people who have enjoyed wealth to buy happiness, there are so many of them. And yet, at the end of their lives, they are unfulfilled. So, you could look, for example, at Howard Hughes, who was arguably at one time the richest man in the world. And of course, that happiness which he enjoyed can be looked at in retrospect. And then you can see what happened to him. He died in great distress. He died in great misery. He died in depression. He died locking himself in the room, living naked, literally psychotic in his behavior. You might think that perhaps the best thing you could do in order to be happy would be not just to have money, but you should, well, enjoy the things of the world. And the best way to do that is to be good looking. If only my nose was like Cleopatra's. If only I was as beautiful as whoever you think is the most beautiful. And the answer? The answer is a very nice Doordarshan program which I saw. It was a program of all the Miss Indias who had won the title of Miss India from the inception to current date when the program was filmed. And when all of them one by one came up, you could see that that beauty which they had was now gone. Not only had that beauty vanished, but it was fairly obvious that if they had any joy coming from that beauty which they possessed, that joy was also definitely considerably diminished, if not gone. So one by one they came, aged, overweight, having lost their looks, and your heart went out to them, not in the way it might have when they won the contests, but because you realized that that beauty which they had built their life upon was no more. Well, you might think that there are other things that could make you happy. Perhaps knowledge could make you happy. Perhaps something else could make you happy. But even one of the greatest translators of the Upanishads and the Bhagawad Geeta himself died in depression. So it's all an illusion that you can attain happiness in the outer world. The truth is, we are citizens of two worlds. We are persons of inner origin, PIOs, and we are persons of outer origin. So we have a world inside of us and we have a world outside of us. Our senses, unfortunately, are like a barroom door, which opens to the outside. So since your senses are like a barroom door that opens to the outside, what do you expect? You look around you and you see things that look beautiful, smell wonderful, taste great, that the touch is enticing. In this way, everything that you find attractive is lying outside of you. And because your focus is on the world outside of you and you're constantly trying to achieve happiness and joy and pleasure in the world outside of you, you very soon reach what I said was tachyphylaxis, which is after some time that pleasure ceases to be pleasure anymore. So you may buy a vehicle, a car, an automobile, maybe a yacht, maybe a jet plane, and you always wanted it. So when you get it, you're very happy. But within 6 months, that happiness goes away. You think you're living in a wonderful house, and you manage to get a beautiful house for yourself. But after some time, its contribution to your total happiness is much less than you expected. So there is happiness in the outer world, which ultimately pales over a period of time. And then there is a happiness that lies in the inner world. And that happiness that comes from the inner world is not hedonic happiness, because hedonic happiness is like going on a treadmill. If any of you have got onto what we call as a stress test, cardiac stress test, you will understand what a treadmill is. You have to keep on running harder and harder and harder and harder until you collapse. So hedonic happiness is like that. You have to keep on running harder and harder and harder to get those pleasures until you collapse. So therefore, it is so important for you to realize that happiness does not lie in the outer world alone, but true happiness lies in the inner world. Because in the outer world, you have very little control. The outer world, you have very little control. It's a limited control you have. But you also have no control over the desires that entice you in the outer world. So you have desires you cannot control and a world you cannot control. That is surely a recipe for unhappiness and disaster. More than that, your outer world, which is visible to you, including your physical body, soon proves to be a place of misery. Because Krishna pointed it out first. It was not the Buddha who pointed it out first. It was Krishna in the Bhagawad Geeta who pointed it out first, hundreds of years before Buddha. Krishna says this world is a dukhalayam ashashvatam. This is a place of misery where everything is temporary. This is a anityam asukham lokam. This is a world where nothing is permanent and you cannot find lasting happiness. In fact, when he's telling Arjun on what is knowledge, he says, Janma mrityu jara vyadhi dukkha doshanu darshanam. Birth and death, old age and disease, fault, misfortune and happiness, all of these are guaranteed to everyone. Later, many hundreds of years later, Buddha said that the essence of life is suffering. For he said, birth is suffering, death is suffering, old age is suffering, disease is suffering. To be parted from someone you love, that is great suffering. To be forced to bear the presence of someone you cannot tolerate, that is even greater suffering. So indeed, if this world is a place of suffering where everything is temporary, where the temptations and the opportunities for desires are infinite, where your control over the environment to continue feeding you these pleasures is finite indeed, how can we ever aspire to happiness? So indeed, those who have studied happiness in the biggest universities give the Greek example of hedonic happiness, which is doomed to failure, And then they talk of what is known as eudaimonic happiness. Eudaimonic happiness is that happiness that arises from within. It's a happiness that does not depend on pleasures of the world. It depends upon that sense of fulfillment that arises from a life well lived. When a person feels content and at the same time he feels he has lived his life well, he has performed all his duties in an exemplary manner, when he has lived an ideal path, when he has lived for something far, far greater than himself, when he has worked at something which expands beyond his limited self, then he feels the inner glow of eudaimonic happiness. Krishna speaks of this happiness in the Bhagavad Geeta and explains the path of Sankhya and how happiness can be tamasic, how happiness can be rajasic, and how happiness can be sattvic. So I'd like you to first of all understand that when we are talking of sattva, rajas, and tamas, we are not talking Vedanta. There are many people who have not understood Bhagavad Gita and who have, of course, not understood Vedanta. And they try to teach sattva, rajas, and tamas as being part of Vedanta. Vedanta doesn't teach sattva, rajas, tamas. This is a teaching of nothing more and nothing less than Sankhya philosophy. And in Sankhya philosophy, from Sankhya philosophy, Krishna has described in the Bhagavad Gita the three types of happiness according to the gunas. Tamagun, Krishna explains, is that guna of ignorance. And the happiness that one gets from Tamagun is indeed a happiness which leads to Yadagare chanu bande cha sukham mohanam atmana nidra alasya pramaduttam tattamasam udaritam. This is chapter 18, verse 39. That happiness that leads to delusion, which brings about complete ignorance of the spiritual nature of the soul, which is based upon sleep, intoxication, heedlessness, is known as tamasic happiness. So what happens in the world when people seek happiness? They think the best thing to do is to smoke some grass, to smoke marijuana, to smoke charas, to take recreational drugs. Most common recreational drug is alcohol. So when they are taking alcohol, when they consume tobacco, when they consume other recreational drugs, and of course now we know that in the United States, the largest number of deaths, hundreds of thousands of deaths, are occurring due to fentanyl, oxycontin, and so many other drugs which are meant for medicinal purposes are being used for recreational purposes. All of these, including that pleasure which comes from consuming alcohol, which comes from intoxication, which brings about sleep, which brings about heedlessness, that even though they're drunk, they want to drive. So when they're told, look, don't drive, you had one too many. Oh, nonsense, I'm not drunk at all. This hardly affects me. This is called heedlessness. Pramadottam. It means one who completely is heedless of any good advice. So this happiness is known as happiness in Tamogun. It gives you misery in the beginning because you may not realize it, but all of these recreational drugs, starting with alcohol and tobacco, are toxic for the body. Many people think that having a drink a day is very good for you. This advice is given by alcoholic doctors, and it is given by people who are influenced by the money that is paid by the alcohol lobby to demonstrate that alcohol is good for health. Alcohol is not good for health, even at one peg a day. I have, in fact, people I know and even people related to me who have actually, through the consumption of alcohol, developed cirrhosis of the liver, esophageal varices, bleeding and vomiting, liver failure, and ultimately death. Similarly with tobacco. So many of my friends who were taking tobacco no longer live today because that led to so many diseases, different types of cancer, led to lung failure, it led to heart disease, so many problems. So this tamasic happiness which you pursue is misery in the beginning, because from the beginning it starts damaging your organs internally. And it is misery in the end. So it is misery in the beginning and misery in the end. This is called tamasic happiness. Yadagre chanu bande cha sukham mohanam atmana nidralasya pramaduttam tat tamasam udaritam. That happiness which leads to delusion of your spiritual nature from beginning to the end, which is derived from sleep, indolence, heedlessness, intoxication, is said to be in the mode of ignorance. Then Krishna explains that there is happiness which is in the mode of Rajaguna. In the mode of Rajaguna, which is the mode of passion, you have a happiness which is like nectar in the beginning, but it is poison in the end. Vishaya Indriya Samyogad Yadtadagre Amritopamam Pariname Vishamiva Sukham Rajasam Smritam. So happiness in Rajagun, Krishna explains in chapter 18, verse 38, says that happiness which is in the mode of Rajagun, in the mode of passion, results from the contact of your senses with their objects. So when your senses get in touch with their objects, it gives great delight. But this mode of passion appears like nectar in the beginning, but it eventually results as poison in the end. So the real path of union of the senses with their objects is the source of great sorrow. You think that food tastes good, so it is wonderful to eat, so let me eat more and more and more. And then you suffer from obesity that precipitates a host of other diseases, including diabetes and hypertension and heart failure and fatty liver and so many others. And ultimately, that which appeared to be pleasure in the beginning becomes poison in the end. And you can't stop eating. Then you go for all kinds of horrible procedures which have been invented and get yourself operated, having part of your stomach removed, having intestine bypassed, and so on and so forth. So in the beginning, it is like nectar. In the end, even the simple pleasure of eating can become poison in the end. So also with others, the other types of poison that exist depending on the senses. In the Bhagavad, it is very beautifully described, giving so many animals which have perished through their senses, because of their senses. He gives the example of the musk deer, which smelling this intoxicating musk from beneath its own tail, it runs here and there, not realizing that the happiness, the bliss of that scent comes from within its own body, and it goes into the desert where it suffers and dies without food or water. Similarly, the fish, desiring to eat something tasty, goes and bites onto a hook fish hook that contains an attractive wiggling worm, and ultimately, as the fish hook sinks into its roof of its mouth, it is dragged out to its death. In the old days, the hunter who wanted to shoot the deer did not have a rifle, but he would shoot with a bow and arrow. So what he would do was that to come close to the deer, he would play the flute. And as he played the flute, the deer would come closer and closer and closer and closer. And when it came closer and closer and closer, the hunter shot the arrow and killed the deer. This is an example of how the ear can lead to one's death when it is attracted to the objects of hearing. So one after another, then you have the elephant. The best way to catch a bull elephant is to lead a female elephant in front of it. And the female elephant is led, directing the bull elephant over a pit covered with grass and chasing the female elephant because of its desire to touch it. It falls into the pit covered by grass and then is subjugated for life. So indeed, the mode of passion is the cause by which you are attracted to objects of the senses. And because you are attracted to objects of the senses, these objects of the senses leading to tachyphylaxis and overindulgence ultimately result in your misfortune and even to your death. In Bhagavad Geeta, chapter 18, verse 37, Krishna explains, Yad tadagre vishamiva pariname amritopamam tat sukham satvikam proktam atma buddhi prasadejam. That which appears to be poison in the beginning, but in the end it is like nectar, is said to be happiness in the mode of Sattva Gun. It is generated by none other than turning to the inner world that lies within. So you have an inner world, and all the efforts you make towards turning to the inner world and bringing peace to the inner world are all the cause of sattvic happiness. And when you turn to the inner world, you bring about peace in the inner world. While the initial part may require a lot of discipline, it may require yajna, it may require tapasya, it will require chanting, it will require meditation, it may require mindful performance of yoga asanas, and it may require so many other things, the pursuit of knowledge, all of this, spiritual knowledge, all of this might appear like poison in the beginning, but in the end, it is like nectar. So, I did this earlier when we covered the subject of Kathopanishad and its relevance to the Bhagavad Geeta. So, in the Kathopanishad, this is experienced or described as Shreyas and Preyas. Shreyas is that which leads to enlightenment. Shreyas is that which leads to an awareness of the inner world and progress in the inner world and purification of the inner world. Whereas Preyas is rajasic happiness. It is looking for delight in the things of the world outside of us. And naturally, that leads to misery and unhappiness. So be wise, be intelligent. I don't say that you should forego your legitimate sense pleasures. After all, you have to eat to maintain your body and soul together. Nothing says that you should not eat something that you enjoy, which is nourishing, which is healthy, which is sattvic ahar, which as described in the Bhagavad Geeta. But be careful. Hitabhuk, ritabhuk, ashakabhuk. Eat that which is in season. Eat that which is, don't eat that which is forbidden, and eat that which is beneficial to you and nourishing to you. So similarly, we have legitimate pleasures of the senses in the world. Be sure that you understand that that is rajasic happiness. Shun tamasic happiness. And focus your attention on how you can attain sattvic happiness. When you are pursuing sattvic happiness, progress may appear slow, but over a period of time, you will experience that happiness from which no one can bring you back when you are truly blissful and happy. And that blissful happiness comes from forgetting oneself. The best way to do that is by remembering God. So if you can remember God and forget oneself, this is the best way by which you can bring about happiness, which is permanent and which is lasting, which transcends even sattvic happiness. So with this, I will conclude. If anyone has any questions, please feel free to ask.
Yes, of course. Good morning, sir. And so I'll start with the first question. So one feels happy because of something outside is not necessarily be the source of happiness for the other. So why do we not understand that the object outside is not the source of our happiness, but our own mind is?
Lack of spiritual education.
Yes. So should I go with the other
Yes.
question? Yes. So can we say that happiness is an illusion just like the sadness? Because it does not stay with us permanently. as a yogi is also beyond happiness and sadness.
Yes. So this happiness that we pursue is indeed a form of illusion. It's described in the Shastras, and I think it was picked up from there and repeated by the Buddha, that there is a man who is being pursued by a tiger, and he runs from the tiger. And while running from the tiger, he sees a well, and holding on to the rope, he jumps into the well. When he is about to climb down the rope, he sees that inside the well, there is a whole nest of cobras, poisonous cobras. Above him, there is a tiger waiting for him to climb out of the well. The rope is frayed and it is being eaten by two mice. One is dark, black mouse, and the other is a white mouse, like day and night. And while he is terrified by the tiger outside, he sees that his time is limited by the black and white mouse eating the rope, which will drop him into the well filled with poisonous cobras. He finds there is something that is falling from the top of the cover of the well. And he finds that there is a beehive. And in that beehive, there is a nest full of bees. And they are manufacturing honey. And the honey, which is so full in the hive, it starts dripping from there. So leaning his head, he finds that he is able to get drip, drip, drip drops of honey. And he forgets momentarily about the tiger outside, the mice nibbling at the rope, and the snakes waiting for him in the bottom of the well. And reaching for that honey, he says, ah, this is happiness. So think deeply on this analogy. It will help you to realize what you think you are seeking in the world.
Yes, of course. So, can we say that the more we rely on our physical senses, the sadder we become at the end?
Yes, indeed. When we become dependent on them, we become unhappy. But at the same time, I would not be so foolish as to say that don't enjoy the world. You have to have a balance between the inner world and the outer world. Like the two wings of a bird. So you engage in finding that happiness in the inner world, but do not refuse that happiness which comes naturally from the outer world. Apuryamanam achalo pratishtam samudram apah pravishanti yadvat tadvat kama pravishanti sarve so shantim apnoti na kama kama. Krishna explains that the sage of steady wisdom is like the ocean. The ocean does not refuse the rivers that flow into it in the flood. Even though it is full, it says, welcome, welcome. It takes the rivers in flood in the monsoon. And in the summer's heat, when there is no rain and the rivers are drying up or dried up, the ocean doesn't think, Arey, how sad, I have no rivers entering into me. The ocean always remains full. So also we have to take delight in the self, in the spirit. And by taking delight in the spirit, we are always full. And the things of the world, they are like the rivers that flow into the ocean. If they're there, that's great. If they're not there, so what? I'm full within anyway. Santushta satatam yogi yatatma drida nishchaya. Mayar pita mano buddhir yo mad bhaktaha sametya. The yogi is always content. Santushta satatam yogi. But that doesn't mean he's inactive. He endeavors in the world with great determination. Surrendering all his mind and intelligence and efforts unto the Lord, such is the devotee of Krishna.
Absolutely, sir. So, sir, these were our questions for today. And thank you so much for such a beautiful session on happiness. And thank you, sir. We will see you next time.
Okay, Hari Om, Jai Shri Krishna.
Jai Shri Krishna, sir. Thank you so much.